At dawn on September 2, 1945, the rising sun broke over a defeated empire. Tokyo Bay lay still beneath a haze of smoke and salt air, the great hulk of the USS Missouri looming like a steel mountain. On her decks, Japanese officials bowed in silence, signing away the war that had consumed Asia and the Pacific for 8 long years. U.S. Navy log Sept. 2, 1945, yet, far from the formality of surrender, in the shattered neighborhoods of Yokohama, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and countless other cities, ordinary Japanese civilians woke to a different kind of reality: hunger, rubble, and silence. Factories no longer roared. Trains lay derailed, fields burned black from firebombing, and into this landscape of ashes, strangers appeared, American soldiers, armed not only with rifles and steel helmets, but with something utterly unthinkable: food. On one street corner in Tokyo, a group of children, barefoot and ragged, watched with unblinking eyes as a tall soldier from Iowa knelt in the dust. He unwrapped a small square of wax paper, folded it back, and revealed 2 slices of white bread pressed around a thick smear of brown paste. Peanut butter, something so mundane to the Americans, yet so alien to Japanese civilians who had endured years of rationing rice, millet, and sweet potatoes. The children stared. Then, to their disbelief, the soldier broke the sandwich in half and offered it to them. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. The moment felt almost surreal. To civilians who had been raised on years of propaganda, the Americans were supposed to be demons, barbarians, destroyers. Instead, they gave food. Some accepted cautiously. Others fled in fear, but slowly word spread across ruined cities. The enemy brought rations. For many, this was the first taste of bread, of canned meat, of chocolate, of peanut butter, foods that seemed like luxuries from another planet. But this image of unexpected generosity did not appear from nowhere. To understand why American soldiers were able to offer food, even in the ruins of their former enemy, one must step back to the final months of the war and to the staggering scale of American logistics that dwarfed the Axis powers. By 1945, the United States was not only arming its soldiers with rifles and tanks, it was feeding them with industrial abundance. Millions of tons of canned rations, dehydrated milk, tinned meat, and yes, peanut butter sandwiches crossed the Pacific in endless convoys. Quartermaster Corps Report, 1945. Japan, by contrast, had been strangled. Allied submarines prowled the seas, sinking merchant ships at a devastating rate. By the summer of 1945, Japan had lost over 80% of its merchant fleet. Rice shipments from Korea and Taiwan never arrived. Fish could not be caught in mined waters. Civilians survived on barely 1,600 calories a day, often less. Children fainted in schools. Mothers bartered heirlooms for scraps. Imperial Home Ministry Report, July 1945. Into this vacuum of despair came the Americans, first as occupiers, then as unexpected suppliers of relief. It was a staggering reversal of fate. The Japanese soldier who once believed he fought for a divine empire now walked home through burned-out cities, surrendering to an opponent who not only overwhelmed him with steel and firepower, but also with bread and peanut butter. Still, the first encounters were laced with tension. Many Japanese civilians could not comprehend that these armed men, who had just days before been dropping bombs, could also be kind. Rumors swirled. Was the food poisoned? Was it a trick? Survivors recalled how children would nibble cautiously, ready to spit it out. Yet hunger overcame fear. Within weeks, stories multiplied of Americans giving away rations, handing chocolate bars to orphans, even inviting civilians to taste Spam and peanut butter sandwiches in mess tents. Oral history, Yokohama Civilian Diary, 1946. For the U.S. Army, this was not only an act of kindness but policy. General Douglas MacArthur, appointed Supreme Commander of the Allied powers, understood that Japan could not be rebuilt through punishment alone. Stability required food. Convoys were redirected. Warehouses were emptied. The American military government coordinated with Japanese officials to distribute rice, flour, and canned goods. But on the ground, to the eyes of hungry civilians, it was the GI with his ration pack who became the face of this new reality. The peanut butter sandwich became more than food. It became a symbol. It was the taste of an unfamiliar world, of industrial power beyond imagination, of a culture where wheat bread replaced rice and nuts became a paste spread on top. For Japanese civilians, many of whom had never seen a peanut before, it was alien. Sweet, salty, oily filling, it stuck to the roof of the mouth. Some loved it instantly, others gagged at its strangeness, but none forgot it. Bundesarchiv, translated Civilian Diary, 1945. The shock was cultural as much as material. Propaganda had taught the Japanese to expect cruelty from Americans. Instead, soldiers smiled and handed out food. For some, this provoked shame, accepting food from the very men who had destroyed their homes. For others, it ignited hope. If the enemy could show mercy, perhaps survival was possible. This moment of unexpected generosity carried profound weight, because behind every sandwich, every ration tin, was the industrial miracle of American logistics. Factories in Chicago, Detroit, and Kansas had churned out not only tanks and planes, but canned beans, powdered eggs, and peanut butter by the millions of jars. American engineers and quartermasters understood that an army marched on its stomach. Their enemies did not. And so, by war's end, the United States could feed not only its own men, but also the civilians of a conquered nation. Still, beneath the small acts of kindness lay a darker truth. The very abundance that allowed a soldier to share a sandwich was the same abundance that had burned cities to the ground. The peanut butter that delighted a starving child was born of the same industrial might that forged bombers and napalm. The paradox haunted survivors. How could the same hand that destroyed also give? In the weeks after surrender, American rations became lifelines. Civilians lined up outside distribution centers. Children learned to beg for chocolate, biscuits, and bread. Soldiers laughed, shared, and sometimes hoarded, but the overall memory endured. The Americans brought food. To a nation on its knees, that mattered as much as the end of gunfire. Yet deeper questions lingered in the minds of many. Why did the Americans have so much? Why had Japan, once so proud and mighty, collapsed into starvation, while the enemy seemed to drown in abundance? The answer lay not in cruelty or kindness, but in technology, logistics, and production, hidden forces that decided the fate of nations. And it is here, in the warehouses of Detroit, the oil fields of Texas, the peanut farms of Georgia, and the ingenious supply chains of the Quartermaster Corps, that the true story begins. Because what Japanese civilians tasted in that simple sandwich was not just food. It was the distilled essence of America's hidden advantage. And in the next chapter of this story, we will uncover how the U.S. military's ability to feed its soldiers, and even its former enemies, became one of the most decisive, yet overlooked weapons of the entire war. The secret lay not in the battlefield itself, but in the supply lines that stretched across oceans and continents. By 1945, the American war machine had achieved something the Axis never could: the ability to deliver not only bullets and bombs, but hot meals, fresh bread, and jars of peanut butter to the very front lines of war. Quartermaster Corps Report, 1945. This advantage was not born overnight. In 1941, even before Pearl Harbor, U.S. planners understood that a global war would not be won by battleships alone. It would be won by the invisible lifeline of logistics. Quartermaster General Edmund Gregory and a network of engineers, factory managers, and agricultural scientists began a revolution in military supply. They standardized rations, streamlined packaging, and mobilized farms and canneries to a scale unmatched in human history. U.S. War Department Memo, DEC 1941. At the heart of this effort was the humble K-ration and its successors. Each small box contained canned meat, biscuits, powdered drink, candy, and yes, packets of peanut butter or cheese spread. Designed by Dr. Ancel Keys, a physiologist from the University of Minnesota, these rations were compact, calorie-dense, and durable, intended to keep a soldier alive for days in the field. Technical Manual TM 10480, 1943. The innovation was staggering. While Japanese soldiers often carried just a handful of rice balls wrapped in seaweed or dried fish stuffed into cloth pouches, Americans had standardized calorie-rich meals sealed against heat and moisture. One K-ration provided about 2,130 calories. By comparison, Japanese rations often fell below 1,800 calories, and supply breakdowns frequently left men with even less. Imperial Army Provisions Report, 1944. But the true genius lay in scale. American factories produced rations not by the thousands, but by the hundreds of millions. In 1943 alone, over 100 million K-rations rolled off assembly lines. Peanut butter, a uniquely American staple, became a central ingredient. It was cheap, high in protein, and didn't spoil in tropical climates. The National Peanut Council, along with processors in Georgia, Alabama, and Virginia, transformed humble farm harvests into industrial war food. Agricultural Adjustment Agency Report 1943, to the Japanese, encountering such abundance was unfathomable. Diaries captured their disbelief. "The enemy eats like gods," wrote one officer after inspecting captured rations on Guadalcanal. "They have candy, bread, butter. We have nothing." Dramatized composite. Captured diary, Guadalcanal, 1942, U.S. Translation Division. The decisive proof of this hidden advantage came during one of the Pacific's bloodiest battles, the Battle of Okinawa. On April 1, 1945, 1,500 U.S. Navy ships surrounded the island. 180,000 soldiers and Marines prepared to land against 100,000 dug-in Japanese defenders. It would become the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War. U.S. Navy Operations Report, April 1945. The fighting was brutal. Rain turned the hillsides into rivers of mud. Japanese artillery rained shells into landing zones. Kamikaze aircraft hurled themselves into transports, igniting explosions across the fleet. By June, nearly 14,000 Americans lay dead, and over 72,000 were wounded. Japanese losses were catastrophic. Over 77,000 killed, with thousands more civilians caught in the crossfire. War Department Casualty Report, Aug. 1945. Yet through this carnage, one constant held: American troops never starved. Convoys poured ashore crates of rations, feeding divisions even under bombardment. Engineers laid down portable docks. The Seabees constructed supply depots overnight, and field kitchens churned out meals. Soldiers exhausted from the caves of Shuri Line would still find rations waiting: biscuits, spam, chocolate, and peanut butter spread. Bureau of Ships Report, 1945. Japanese defenders had no such luxury. Cut off from supplies, many lived on a handful of rice and rainwater. Diaries describe soldiers fainting in bunkers, their uniforms hanging loose from starvation. One Japanese officer wrote, "The Americans fight with full bellies. We fight with empty stomachs. How can the Emperor expect us to win?" Dramatized composite. Japanese Army Officer Diary, Okinawa, 1945, translation. The disparity was more than physical. It was psychological. Soldiers who eat fight longer, shoot straighter, think clearer. Hunger erodes morale as surely as bullets tear flesh. American planners understood this truth. By feeding their men consistently, they maintained not only combat effectiveness but confidence. A Marine on Okinawa recalled, "Even when shells were falling, we always had chow. I don't know how they did it, but we never went hungry." Oral History, Marine Veteran Interview, 1962. Behind the front lines, engineers and technicians played a silent but crucial role. Refrigeration units powered by General Electric kept meat fresh on supply ships. Portable bakeries, designed by quartermaster engineers, produced thousands of loaves of bread daily. Mobile water purification systems ensured safe drinking water in tropical jungles. Each invention, each refinement, reflected the work of countless civilians who never saw the battlefield but shaped its outcome. Bureau of Supplies Report, 1944. Even packaging became a weapon. American rations were vacuum-sealed in waterproof cans and waxed cartons. Japanese rations, by contrast, spoiled quickly in humidity. Worms and mold often ruined rice supplies. Peanut butter, thick and oil-rich, could survive tropical heat that turned fish and rice rancid. Technical Manual TM 9294, 1943. The Battle of Okinawa revealed the full power of these innovations. While Japanese units collapsed from malnutrition, American forces could rotate fresh troops, resupply easily, and sustain pressure for weeks. The ability to maintain endurance proved decisive. By the time General Mitsuru Ushijima committed ritual suicide on June 22nd, his army was broken not only by artillery and tanks, but by hunger and despair. Imperial Army Report, Post-War Interrogation, 1946. From Okinawa, the lesson was unmistakable. The war was no longer a contest of courage or strategy alone. It was a war of logistics, and in logistics the United States reigned supreme. As American soldiers landed in Japan after the surrender, their rations came with them. For the first time, Japanese civilians tasted the abundance that had sustained the enemy through years of relentless warfare. A sandwich with peanut butter was not just food, it was evidence of a hidden empire of supply lines, factories, and farms. And this hidden advantage would not end with Okinawa. In the months of occupation that followed, America's capacity to feed not only its armies, but its defeated enemies, would shape the fate of a nation. The Japanese, weary and starved, now faced a startling question. Could the same abundance that destroyed them also rebuild them? The war was over, but the hunger remained. In the fall of 1945, Japan faced one of the worst food crises in its history. Rice harvests had collapsed. Shipping lanes remained shattered. The black market flourished, but ordinary families often found only millet gruel and foraged weeds to eat. Malnutrition spread through cities and villages alike. Mothers fainted in ration lines, children's ribs pressed through their skin, and winter threatened to bring starvation on a scale unseen in generations. Imperial Home Ministry report, Octo 1945, into this void stepped the very enemy who had laid waste to Japan's cities. American convoys streamed into Yokohama and Kobe, carrying not bombs, but sacks of flour, crates of canned goods, powdered milk, and yes, millions of jars of peanut butter. Under the authority of General Douglas MacArthur and the Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, food relief became the cornerstone of occupation policy. SCAP Administrative Order, Nov 1945. The impact was immediate and profound. Where once soldiers carried rifles, now trucks delivered bread. Where bombers had darkened the skies, now C-47 transports dropped food to isolated communities. The symbol of American power shifted from destruction to nourishment. Civilians who had once hidden in caves from firebombs now lined up at relief stations, receiving wheat flour that was baked into bread by Japanese bakeries under U.S. supervision. U.S. Army Quartermaster Report, Jan 1946. Psychologically, this shift stunned the Japanese people. Many had been raised to believe that Americans were monsters. Now they saw GIs kneel to hand chocolate to a child or share a peanut butter sandwich with a family. The effect was disorienting, but also deeply humanizing. For civilians who had known only propaganda and fear, these moments cracked the wall of hatred built over years of war. One Hiroshima survivor recalled, "The Americans gave us bread. We had nothing. It was so strange to take food from the same people who had burned our city. But I could not hate them when my children were eating." Oral History, Hiroshima Civilian Diary, 1946. The generosity was not without calculation. American planners understood that feeding Japan was not simply charity, it was strategy. Starving populations breed unrest. Hunger could fuel communist uprisings, destabilize the occupation, and even turn civilians against Reconstruction. By providing food, the U.S. built legitimacy and ensured a smoother transition to peace. In the words of one occupation officer, "We conquered them with firepower, but we will keep them with bread." U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. Still, the scale of the operation was staggering. Between 1945 and 1952, the United States shipped over 5.3 million tons of food to Japan. Wheat imports transformed Japanese diets, giving rise to bread, noodles, and eventually a fusion cuisine that still endures. Schools served lunches of bread, milk, and peanut butter sandwiches, meals children would remember for the rest of their lives. U.S. Department of Agriculture Report, 1947. Peanut butter itself carried a strange legacy. For Americans, it was an everyday staple, born of George Washington Carver's agricultural research and mass-produced by companies like Swift & Company and Skippy during the war. For Japanese civilians, it was an exotic curiosity. Sticky, salty sweet, and unlike anything they had tasted before. Some loved it instantly. Others found it strange, even unpleasant, but all associated it with the Americans. It became in memory the taste of occupation, of survival, of a nation rebuilt from hunger. National Peanut Council publication, 1948. The psychological contrast between abundance and deprivation left a deep imprint. Post-war interrogations of Japanese officers revealed an enduring sense of shock at America's ability to feed both its armies and its former enemies. "We could not believe the Americans had so much," confessed one former general. "Our soldiers starved on the front. Their soldiers were fat, and still they gave food to our civilians. It broke our spirit." Post-war interrogation report, Tokyo, 1946. This shock reshaped Japanese identity in ways that endured long beyond the occupation. For many civilians, the memory of eating American rations became intertwined with survival. Bread and peanut butter were not just food. They were proof that defeat did not mean annihilation. They were symbols of a strange mercy, of a conqueror who chose to rebuild rather than destroy. Engineers and technicians played their quiet roles even here. Quartermaster engineers adapted ration packaging for civilian distribution. American nutritionists calculated balanced meals for school children. Shipping specialists coordinated fleets of freighters to move grain across the Pacific. Behind every sandwich was a vast machinery of logistics, industry, and science. Proof that wars were no longer won by soldiers alone, but by the invisible hands of workers, farmers, and engineers. Technical Division Memo SCAP, 1946. The legacy extended into the Cold War. American leaders viewed Japan not merely as a defeated nation, but as a potential bulwark against communism in Asia. Feeding Japan was as much a political weapon as it was a humanitarian act. And in this sense, the peanut butter sandwich handed to a starving child was no less a tool of strategy than an aircraft carrier or an atomic bomb. U.S. State Department Briefing, 1947. Over time, these small acts reshaped the relationship between two former enemies. Trust was not built overnight, but each ration shared, each loaf of bread baked, eroded hostility. By the early 1950s, Japan had begun its astonishing economic recovery, powered in part by American aid and imports. A nation that had once dreamed of empire rebuilt itself into a democracy, its children nourished not by imperial rice, but by American wheat and peanuts. Yet the memory of hunger never disappeared. For the generation that grew up in the ruins, food remained a visceral symbol. Survivors remembered the first taste of chocolate, the strangeness of bread, the sticky mouthfeel of peanut butter. Decades later, those memories resurfaced in memoirs, novels, and interviews, a reminder that wars are not only remembered in battles and treaties, but in the taste of what was given and what was lost. NHK Oral History Collection, 1985. By the late 20th century, peanut butter sandwiches had become more than a memory of occupation. They were an echo of the larger truth that emerged from the war. In modern conflict, the power to feed is as decisive as the power to fight. America's ability to sustain its soldiers and then to sustain its former enemies reshaped not only the outcome of World War II, but the entire balance of the post-war world. As one Japanese teacher wrote in 1947, "The children eat bread and smile. They laugh when they taste peanut butter. They will never forget this kindness. Perhaps this is how peace begins." School Teacher's Diary, Yokohama, 1947. The story of peanut butter in post-war Japan may seem small compared to the clash of armies and the thunder of bombs. Yet in that smallness lies its power. It captures the paradox of war and peace, destruction followed by renewal, cruelty tempered by mercy, and enemies turned, however uneasily, into partners. And so, as history looks back on the ruins of Tokyo, the ashes of Hiroshima, and the firestorms of Osaka, another image endures. A soldier kneeling in the dust, handing a sandwich to a starving child, a gesture simple, almost trivial, yet in its simplicity, a symbol of something larger. Because in the end, victory was not just measured in territory gained or battles won. It was measured in the ability to rebuild, to nourish, to turn an enemy into a future ally. And perhaps the lesson of that moment is as true now as it was then. In modern war, connection outweighs firepower. And sometimes peace begins not with treaties, but with the simple sharing of a meal.